So why is ontology important? Well, as most of you know, I imagine, ontology goes back to the work of the Greek philosophers. So Aristotle used the word metaphysics, or Aristotle's students used the word metaphysics to describe something very like what we are now calling ontology today. What happened, however, is that in the last 20 years or so, computer scientists and information scientists started talking about building ontology. And some of that activity was inspired in part by the philosophical tradition of ontology, and some of it was quite independent of the philosophical tradition of ontology. They just borrowed the word. Now, what we're going to try and do is to explore why it is that ontology, in something like the philosophical sense of the word, can be useful in the current age of computer-driven science. Not just science, but also computer-driven administration, government, banking, manufacturing. The word ontology is being used by people in all of these areas to increasing degrees. Here in Buffalo, we have quite a number of people working on biomedical ontology. We also have people working for military projects connected with ontology, and we'll be addressing some of their interests and concerns in the course of the semester. But the concerns are quite generic. They apply everywhere where you have large amounts of data which are being collected by different groups of researchers or administrators or whatever it might be. And the problem is that you can't find your data. That's because when you build a database, you characteristically will build it using terms which are useful and familiar to you, but which are not useful and familiar to other people. Moreover, you will forget what you meant by terms that you used in building your databases some years ago, because they will be acronyms or they will be special codes which are convenient because they enable you to fit your columns onto the screen of your computer more successfully. This is a problem which arises over and over again in many, many areas, that people create databases, and those databases make the data very hard to find. Moreover, they make the data hard to reason with. So if you want to put together data which was collected about military salaries with data which is being collected about military suicides, then you'll find it very difficult to make any kind of connections between those two sets of data. And ontology arose as an answer to this problem of finding data and reasoning with data, integrating data, surveying data. The idea is that if for any given domain you can create an ontology for that domain, and we'll see what that means in a minute, then you can use that ontology to tag the data in the databases in a uniform way, which is common to everybody who is collecting data about people or suicides or salaries or whatever it might be. Now, Google, for a long time, resisted the idea that ontology technology might be useful in performing the tasks which Google performs. But now Google, too, has embraced the idea that if we have a simple list of terms, like restaurant, which can be used in tags within websites in a uniform way, then that will help Google do its job of finding information about, for instance, things like restaurants. I assume that most people here at least know what an iPhone is. And in iPhone, there is a built-in application called Siri, which was created by one of the leading ontologists, a man called Tom Gruber, and it contains a simple ontology of things like requests and emails and telephones and so forth, which enables the Siri app to recognize your requests for things like telephone numbers or email addresses. So ontology is increasingly an important part of the way people in all kinds of contexts are dealing with data. Someone has to build these ontologies, and someone has to ensure that we don't recreate using ontologies exactly the same kinds of problems which databases created in the first place. And so what we need is common ontologies. And that this course is about common ontologies. It's about ontologies that people share in common. Now, if people are going to share ontologies, they need to trust them. And if people are going to trust them, they need to be good. And they need to be recognizable as good. But what is it for an ontology to be good? Now, that is, I don't like this, but that is a philosophical problem. I don't like it because philosophy wastes time. I'd much rather do practical things. But as it happens, we have to think a little bit about philosophical issues if we're going to understand what makes an ontology good. And in fact, we're going to think quite a lot about that question already today. We'll come back to it at various later points. So, in the simplest possible terms, a good ontology is one which will integrate well with ontologies you already have. But that presupposes that you already have good ontologies. And so the problem still arises. Now, in science, we already have some examples of good ontology. Almost all of them are in biology. There are some examples in physics. There are some examples in medicine, but almost all of the ontologies which are successful because they are common ontologies used by lots and lots of people to tag or label or annotate their data. Almost all of them are in biology. Now, as we will see in a minute, Buffalo is a center of activity in trying to create a suite of common ontologies for use across the whole of biology. So many, many ontologies. And this corresponds to the fact that in science, people want to share their data and people want other people to find and use their data because that's how scientists become successful, because people use their work. So in science, and particularly in biology, there is a kind of hunger for ways in which people can describe their data in such a way that other people can find it and use it. And so that's why ontology in biology particularly has been successful. And you can see that most of the people, so this is not everyone who does ontology here, but most of the people who do ontology here are involved in biological projects. So I'm involved in various bioinformatics projects. And then we have these other people who will be here in some of these sessions. So the next week's session is on Labor Day, and so it will not take place. But the following session will be led by my friend Werner Koisters there, who is he's not really a psychiatrist, but he was trained as a psychiatrist. Anyway, you'll see what he does when he comes in 2 weeks. Now, we have all of these grants, and some of the people in this room are indeed working on some of those grants, which are grants given for people here in Buffalo to build ontologies or to help other people build ontologies to support medical research. And some of this work is quite influential. So there are dozens of people throughout the world who are collaborating with the UB people working on these grants to build ontologies for things like understanding cell types or understanding infectious diseases or describing proteins and describing how proteins in mouse relate to proteins in humans, for instance. And Werner is particularly interested in working on the ontology of pain. So he will be talking in 2 weeks' time about how to understand data pertaining to pain. And that this is a grant that he's doing with dentists who know something about pain. Then we have various people working in neurology on things like Alzheimer's disease who are helping us to develop ontologies for those things. We have the Institute for Healthcare Informatics in Buffalo, which is going to start collecting patient data from patients in Buffalo hospitals and in Buffalo clinics, and which is going to be using ontologies to help make that data be usable for clinical research. So the goal in nearly everything that I just mentioned is helping to understand health and disease by having better data, by having data that people can share and aggregate and reason with, even if they're in different institutions, even if they speak different languages, and so on. And then there are these other people who do ontology work in Buffalo in the computer science department, in the information studies department, and we have here one of the 3 sites for the National Center for Biomedical Ontology, which is an NIH-funded consortium. And I should mention, since he's in the room, Ron Rudnicki. Put your hand up, Ron. So Ron is in charge of an ontology project for the military, which he will be talking about on at least one occasion during the course of this semester. And I'm not going to talk much about the military stuff here, but really the problems which we face in trying to enable aggregation and analysis and discovery of, say, intelligence data are very similar to the problems that we find when we're trying to aggregate and analyze clinical data. And ontologies play exactly the same role. Now, if you look at PubMed, which is a database of biomedical research literature, very, very big database, you'll find that ontology is being used more and more by people who publish such literature because they're using the tools of ontology in their research. But if you look at this data more carefully, you'll see that there's just one ontology which is by far the most successful of all of these ontologies, and that's the gene ontology. So the turquoise bar to the right is all mentions of the gene ontology in PubMed, and the other ontologies are squeezed together in that little fraction of the bar to the right. And now there are several reasons why this might be the case. The gene ontology is the oldest biomedical ontology, so it's already 13 years old, which is about 5 epochs in bioinformatics time. It's not, however, the oldest. The oldest is SNOMED, which you can see is still, even in spite of huge amounts of government funding, still not being used very much. So the gene ontology is doing something right. And it's the gene ontology that is the primary inspiration for what we do. We want to be part of the gene ontology's success. And the gene ontology is an ontology for describing proteins, basically. Or rather, it's an ontology for describing what genes and proteins do in an organism, in any organism. And we don't need to say anything more about this, just that it's multi-species. It's designed to describe what genes and proteins do. For instance, bind to other genes and proteins. Molecules bind to each other in any species. And this turns out to be a very useful thing to have because you can compare research data about mice experiments with what you know about corresponding genes or proteins in humans. And then you can do experiments on mice in order to discover facts about humans, which is a very useful thing to be able to do if you're testing new drugs, for instance. And that's why the gene ontology is so much used in the research literature, and it's why the government invests so much money in the GO. A small amount of money is invested in building the GO. A large amount of money is invested in using the GO to tag experimental data. That's NIH. Although some drug companies have invested in the GO, and some European agencies also invest in the GO, but primarily the funding for biomedical ontology research is NIH. Any other questions? All right. So Go is amazingly successful because Go has shown how to overcome the problem of data balkanization or data silos. And but the Go only covers 3 kinds of terms. Terms describing cellular components, like cell nucleus or cell membrane. Terms describing molecular functions, like binding. And terms describing biological processes, like, for instance, perception of blue light. So there are 40,000 terms in the Go, divided into these 3 groups. And these terms are being used to tag experimental literature by hundreds of people all over the world, all the time, so that you can find all the references in the biomedical literature to illness involving defects in perception of blue light in shrimp, or whatever your favorite organism might be. Yes? So the publications is where the money is primarily invested, but there are people who use the gene ontology to tag databases. But you see that the gene ontology doesn't provide any terms, any common vocabulary for describing diseases or symptoms or lab experiments. It just talks about cellular components, molecular functions, and biological functions. Yes, please. You haven't missed anything. And so what we did, and this is probably the most important contribution of the UB ontology group so far, is we proposed that the gene ontology should be expanded to include some of these other things in biology that the gene ontology itself does not cover. So the yellow is what the gene ontology already has, and we added more things, sometimes by using ontology resources that people had already been developing, sometimes by creating new ones. And now this is where the key question that we raised at the very beginning arises. These are supposed to be common ontologies. We want everyone to use them. The gene ontology is a common ontology. Everyone uses it because it's the biggest show in town, right? The only show in town for cellular components, molecular functions, and biological processes. How are we going to persuade everyone to use our protein ontology or our cell ontology? How are we going to convince people that these should be the common ontology? Well, that's what this course is about, how to build a good ontology and how to convince people that it's a good ontology. Now, I said that one criterion of being a good ontology is that it integrates well with existing ontologies. And in this respect, ontology building is a bit like building a typewriter keyboard. In other words, if you want to build a typewriter keyboard that people will use, that will integrate well with people's skills and expertise, then it's better have the QWERTY arrangement of keys. That's not because the QWERTY arrangement of keys is scientifically true. It's because it's common, it's useful, because it's used. So part of ontology building is like choosing the QWERTY keyboard or choosing to drive on the right side of the road. It's a matter of a convention. And once the convention has been established, then you have to follow it. So that's part of the story here. We are here establishing conventions. And in some areas, you can do things in different ways. And it doesn't really matter which way you do them, as long as everyone does them in the same way. Now to get everyone to do them in the same way is a hard problem because people have egos, people are anarchists, people want to keep what they do secret, and so they deliberately describe it differently so that no one else can find it. All of those are problems which, if we're going to solve the problem of integration, yes? Yeah. So, if we're going to solve this problem, then we need to have arguments for doing it the way we say it should be done. That means it can't all be just convention. And we need to have good arguments. And I'm going to try and provide some good arguments in the course of this semester. But these good arguments don't take away from the fact that some of this is just a matter of getting people to adopt conventions for the sake of uniformity. All right, so the first feature of this picture that you should note is that there is a certain organization here. So you have from the bottom to the top along the vertical axis, you have size or granularity. So the very small grain stuff, molecules and atoms and so forth, is at the bottom. And as you move up, you get larger and larger. And eventually you get to the level where you're dealing with entire populations or species. But then the interesting thing here is the horizontal axis. And the horizontal axis divides everything in reality into two kinds. On the one hand, you have continuants, which are things which continue to exist, things like cells, molecules, organisms. And on the other hand, you have occurrence, which are things which occur, processes. So processes do not continue to exist. Rather, they unfold themselves in successive phases. Now, that distinction between continuance and occurrence is absolutely basic for everything that we do. Yeah? Yeah, I warned you I would be moving around more and more. So this is absolutely basic to everything that we do. And again, it's like the QWERTY keyboard. It's a choice. You could just believe that the world consists of processes. I think that would be a bad choice, but there are some people who make that choice. None of them have yet created an ontology that people use, but maybe they will one day. But we have produced an ontology that people use on the basis of this choice, and so everyone has to follow this choice because we have the ontologies that people use. That's the idea. Now, there is another division in the world of a continuance between what we call independent continuance and dependent continuance. Independent continuance are things which are made of physical particles, basically. Things like planets, molecules, laptops, lumps of rock. And dependent continuance are attributes of those things. Qualities, functions, roles. We'll talk about these in more detail very soon. And we add environments, which are independent continuants in which organisms live. For instance, this room is an environment. The interior of this room, in which air circulates, is an environment. And so is a rabbit hole. All right. Now, this particular collection of ontologies is called the OBO Foundry, Open Biomedical Ontologies Foundry. And there are more OBO Foundry ontologies being built now, and we have a review process which we used to try and keep the quality of the OBO Foundry ontologies high. And we have various rules and regulations for those ontology developers who are part of the OBO Foundry. So we have a governance process, we have editors, we have training events. All the OBO Foundry ontologies share a common architecture, and this is the architecture of continuance and occurrence, which I just described. And what I'm going to do for the rest of today's session is describe this common architecture in as simple terms as I can, and then apply it to music. And I want to apply it to music because I think music will illustrate how we approach some really hard questions, because the goal of creating a suite of ontologies which will cover the whole of biology and which will be useful to the military and to governments and banks and so forth means that the common ontology has to be strong enough, expressive enough to apply to any new challenge that you might present. Because if somebody turns around and says, oh, you can't do temperature, or you can't do heartbeats, or you can't do the speed of light in your ontology, then that would be fatal to the endeavor. It has to be strong enough to deal with hard problems. And so we're going today to deal with a number of hard problems under the heading of music. So this is more about the OBO Foundry, which I will just leap over. These are the main ontologies within the OBO Foundry. If anybody is interested in biology, then they can raise their hand now, and I will talk a little bit more, but otherwise I'll just move on. Well, the part of is an interesting question. So actually, of the ontologies here, the Pro is part of the OBO Foundry in the full sense. Kebi is part. Kebi is also listed twice, which is not good. The cell ontology is a candidate which is being reviewed as we speak. And the OB, Ontology for Biomedical Investigations, is a candidate which is being reviewed as we speak. The FMA was already reviewed and it failed. And the reason it failed is because the FMA is an anatomy ontology, which I think is the best of all ontologies in the biological world. I'm a big fan of the FMA. The FMA was the first ontology I ever looked at when I first started not being a philosopher, which I thought was any good, because the gene ontology itself at that point, which is around 2002, was no good. The problem with the FMA is that it does not satisfy one of the rules of the OBO Foundry, which is that all terms, or at least a large fraction of all terms, have to have definitions. And only a small fraction of terms in the FMA have definitions. So one of the ways in which we ensure that ontologies are high quality is that we insist upon definitions for all the terms. And one of the ways in which we ensure that ontologies are used in a consistent way is by providing definitions so that people can see how those terms should be used. And sometimes it's easy, but sometimes it's less easy. And that's why we have to have definitions. All of the OBO Foundry ontologies are built in the same way. The gene ontology was, in effect, one of the inspirations for this dichotomy between continuance and occurrence. No. The upper level architecture is not something that you want to show to your friendly neighborhood biologist. It will not. You want to hide it, but you want it to be there nevertheless. They populate downwards from it in some sense. Yes, so there are guidelines for definition writing. There are also tools which help you for definition writing. Nowadays, I would say that most of the people who are writing definitions are using those tools. And that's something that we can address later on. But there is one, and I don't know, how many people here attended the Protégé tutorial? Okay, so Protégé is one of those tools. And if anyone is interested, there are videos of the Protégé tutorial and of the BFO tutorial which you can examine online. So you can still do the tutorial. For the Protégé tutorial, you need to contact me and I'll give you the link. And the BFO tutorial, all the links are already there on the wiki, which you can find a link to at the top of my website. Yes. Yeah.
What was the reason? Is because it was difficult to define, or what was the problem?
So I believe that if the FMA had more funding for building up the core ontology, then it wouldn't be such a hard job to write the definition. But all the funding they have is to extend the FMA, particularly in the area of neurology, because there is a demand for more terminological coverage of neurological terms, and that's where the funding for the FMA currently is. There was a question here at the front.
Is FMA BFO somebody working on making a BFO?
Yes. Yes. So the FMA was the first ontology that embraced the idea of being compliant with this upper level architecture I'm talking about. But it was easy because in the FMA everything is an anatomical structure, or it's a site where an anatomical structure is located, like the oral cavity. So there are only two kinds of entities in the FMA: bones and holes. No, because there's no functional component to the FMA. It's a purely structural anatomy.
They do have some It just has, I don't think they ever got to work. If there is a section there that's supposed to be about systems.
Yeah, they may have the term cardiovascular system,
But it
but
never got really
even that is still a thing. It's just a very big collection of bones.
Yeah, it's just not, yeah.
It's a nervous system.
Yeah. So systems are just big collections of connected anatomical structures.
There's an online explorer if you want to use FMA. Just Google it.
Okay. So now let the upper level architecture we're talking about is called basic formal ontology. And basic formal ontology is based upon a central distinction, which is a recognizably philosophical distinction. In fact, we'll see that it's recognizably Aristotelian, between universals and instances, or between generals and particulars. So the term building refers to the universal building, and the term organism refers to the universal organism. But the term Arnold Schwarzenegger refers to a specific instance of that universe. Now, this is a quite simple distinction, which turns out to be quite difficult to provide good rules for the understanding of. So there are borderline cases of being a universal. So, for instance, is member of ABBA a universal? Or friend of member of ABBA? I think obviously not. But I don't have a good argument why friend of member of ABBA is not universal. I think that if you need an argument, then the best argument is that there are no scientists who use friend of member of ABBA to formulate scientific laws. So we can pursue these kinds of disputes at great length, but just as there is no easy way of testing whether an assertion is true or false, so there is no easy way of testing whether a general term, refers to a universal or not. The only thing that you can do in both cases is to see what scientists believe according to the best current scientific understanding. And according to the best current scientific understanding, there are electrons and cells and planets and solar systems and organisms and nervous systems and so on. And therefore, all of those terms refer to universals. And we're not going to say anything more than that until we are dealing with a specific domain where we have issues about which universals should be acknowledged in our ontology. So the idea is that ontologies are representations of universals. We build databases to talk about Arnold Schwarzenegger or to talk about instances, and we build ontologies to talk about universals. And then, because the ontologies talk about universals, they can be reused over and over again to talk about different instances. So ontology is in a way, just the terminological component of a scientific theory. It's that which gets reused over and over again. And I'm going to use the word type and the word category as synonyms for the word universe, almost always. There'll be one sentence where I depart from that, but I will make sure that it's clear. And the distinction between an ontology and a database in this sense is very much like the distinction between a catalog, which tells you what the types of things are in your inventory, and the inventory itself, which tells you how many of each type you have actually on your shelf. So you can think of an ontology as a catalog of entities. And a simple ontology is a Linnaean hierarchy of organisms organized in this hierarchical way. And then we distinguish the universals, which are named by the general term, the instances which are actually observable when doing experiments. This is the FMA, or a small fraction of the FMA. And where this picture only has one relation, which is the subtype relation, also called ISA, as in cat is a mammal, or mammal is a animal. The FMA has two major relations. ISA along the vertical axis and part of along the horizontal axis. So the mesothelium of pleura is a part of the visceral pleura, which is a part of the pleura, which is a kind of organ subdivision. The FMA has, I don't know, 900,000 such links, covering the whole of a given human being, an idealized or canonical human being, so with 2 arms, 2 legs, exactly 32 teeth. So not statistically normal, but normal in the sense that this is the way human genes want to build organisms. All right. So now, if an ontology is a representation of universals, then we have a simple rule that every term in the ontology should represent exactly one universal. And this means that the terms in the ontology should be singular nouns, like organism or headache or planet. Now, I said that this distinction between universals and instances is Aristotelian. So, in fact, a lot in BFO is recognizably Aristotelian. I have a slightly more detailed representation of what that means. So Aristotle had what his successors called his ontological square, which divides universals and particulars in the vertical axis, and it divides what Aristotle called substances from what Aristotle called accidents along the horizontal axis. Now, the substance versus accident corresponds in Aristotle to what BFO calls independent and dependent entities. So you can't have a headache without having a head. You can't have a suntan without having skin. So the suntan is an accident of the skin in Aristotle's terms. Now, the next stage in the prehistory of BFO is I really feel uncomfortable talking about philosophy, but never mind. So there is a German philosopher, actually an Austrian, Bohemian Austrian German philosopher by the name of Edmund Husserl, who published a work called Logical Investigation. And in this work, there is an investigation on parts and wholes. And in this investigation, Husserl coins the idea of a formal ontology. A formal ontology should be an ontology which is domain neutral. It should be capable of being applied in any domain. That's what Husserl meant by formal ontology. And he introduced formal mereology, which is the idea that there are formal laws governing the relations between parts and wholes. For instance, transitivity. If A is a part of B and B is a part of C, then A is a part of C. Husserl was the first person to think that there could be a formal mereology of that kind. But the most interesting feature of Husserl's formal mereology is that he developed it in connection with a formal account of dependence relations. So in other words, he captured a formal aspect of Aristotle's ontological square. And it's that formal aspect of Aristotle's ontological square which served as the starting point for BFO. Now, the third piece of background to BFO is what you might call ontological realism. The idea is that when you describe the world using BFO terms, or using terms from an ontology which has been built in BFO terms, then you're only allowed to talk about what really exists. Now, that might sound like a trivial requirement, but already if you think about certain characteristic medical cases, you can see that it's going to be quite tricky. So how are we going to talk about psychiatric delusions where people believe that they can see unicorns or that they're going to be eaten by a green dragon if you are not allowed to refer to things which do not exist, because there are no unicorns or green dragons. Now, we have reasons for insisting upon this realism requirement, and we have answers to those challenges about unicorns. The one way, I guess, in which this expresses itself, this realism requirement expresses itself positively, is that when we say we're only allowed to talk about what really exists, we allow lots of things to really exist. So not just molecules or physical particles, but also histories, laws, organizations, beliefs, thoughts, ideas, plans, fears, agreements, debts, documents, blueprints, musical works, works of poetry. So we are quite generous in the range of kinds of things that we allow to exist, but we're not absolutely generous. So we still don't allow unicorns. There is no such thing as the absence of an elephant. So there are no absences in reality. Anyway, the point of all of this will become clearer in due course. Now, one positive admission that we make, which is in the spirit of Aristotle's theory of accidents, is that we allow that there are things like headaches. Now again, this might seem trivial. Surely everyone agrees that there are headaches. But actually, most 20th century philosophers would have, most good ones anyway, would have difficulty in accepting that there are such things as headaches. And that's because if you look at Aristotle's ontological square, they didn't allow anything to go in this box. To say that someone has a headache is to say that they instantiate the predicate exemplifies headache. But there is no such thing as a headache which they stand in a relation to. Now, I don't want to talk about that for obvious reasons, but this paper, published in 1984, was an attempt to break out of this restriction in 20th century analytic philosophy, in the mainstream of 20th century analytic philosophy, against talking about things like headaches. Headaches are events like flyings or flights or hurricanes, tornadoes. All of these things are, in this paper, allowed to be first-class entities. Now, there were other people who believed in first-class entities like this in the 20th century, and indeed prior to the 20th century, including Aristotle. But during the 20th century, formal theories of those things are relatively rare, and they're outside the mainstream. Now, BFO, to that degree, was outside the mainstream, perhaps it still is, in philosophy, but who cares about philosophy? All right, now another philosopher who plays a role, and will play a role in our discussion of music, is John Searle, who is normally associated with his theory of speech acts. So Searle was one of 3 or 4 philosophers who recognized that we very often use words not in order to describe the world, but in order to change the world. For instance, by requesting, or commanding, or baptizing, or authorizing, or forbidding, or marrying. Now, the main distinction for our purposes today, which Searle was keen on, is the idea that there are 2 directions of fit between language and the world. The first direction of fit is from mind or language, it doesn't matter for our present purpose. It's what he called a mind-to-world direction of fit. So when you make a statement, you want your statement to fit the world. You want it to be true. You want it to have a truth maker. So if I say, Bill has a headache, I want that to fit the world, and that means fitting the headache that is in Bill. But then there are other ways of using language and other ways of thinking which have a world-to-mind direction of fit. And an example would be when I instruct Bill to close his laptop. Then Bill is, if he accepts my authority, under an obligation to make the world fit what my mind wants it to be like. So basically we have plans and we have records. Plans go first, records go later. But we could use the same thing both to be a plan and a record if the plan is realized. So a blueprint, for instance, can be a part of an instruction set for building a building, or it can be part of a description of how the building is once it's built. Now, all of this will be very important when we get to music. Now, there were various places where ontology originated. I mean ontology in the interesting, practically useful sense. Between around 1970 and around 1998, ontology was used by people within the computer and information world to describe this kind of general representation of universals in reality, but for specific purposes. Now, the first group were people doing AI and robotics. And probably the most important of these people is a man called Patrick Hayes, who in 1982, I believe, published his Naive Physics Manifesto. Naive physics is another word for what we're calling ontology. The idea was that if you want to build a robot who is able to go into a restaurant and buy a salad, then the robot needs to have a theory of salad, and of restaurants, and of chairs, and of customers, and of money, and all of those other things. And he called that big theory naive physics. And BFO is an outgrowth of that idea of naive physics. Big gene ontology was another invention of ontology. It was completely independent of Patrick Hayes. And then I won't talk about that, but BFO, one of the reasons why BFO came into existence was because of a group of people working on formal tools for describing space and time. So then we have the history of BFO itself. So BFO, the first version was in 2004. We will go through these three versions very quickly. It hasn't changed much. Some people say that what we are now calling BFO 2.0 should be called BFO 1.2 because it's not interestingly different from 1.1. But we've already named it now, even though we haven't proved it. So this is a blinding flash of the obvious that we've already seen. We have continuance, occurrence, we have independent, dependent, we have universals, and we have instances. The idea is that this should be a true upper-level ontology, which means that there are no terms in BFO which anyone would want to use to describe anything that is interesting or specific. It's completely domain neutral. So there are no minds, no people, no organizations, no language, nothing in BFO except things like this. Now, there are, in fact, more than just this, but they're all very, very generic. Now, BFO has many users, more than any other upper-level ontology. And it's trying to be very simple. So generally speaking, BFO has qualities, but it doesn't have qualities of qualities. BFO has universals, but it doesn't have universals of universals. So the universal is not accepted. All the instances of universals in BFO are not universals. They're instances, particularly. And similarly, for all the other parts of BFO, there's no iteration.
Are these like the traffic laws you're talking about, or are these like philosophical laws?
That's a traffic law. So there's no reason why we couldn't extend BFO with some iteration. It would make it harder and thereby use losers, make the documentation more difficult, and take away some computational benefits. So for all of those reasons, we don't want it to get bigger. We don't need this. We've talked about this. Now we're coming to the music part. So it will take a long time. We need to go through Apples and other things, the Beatles. So the idea is that when we see reality around us, we see molecules, we see particles, but we also see chairs, apples, people. And the question is, how do the molecules, the physical particles, the quanta of energy that are all around us, how do they relate to the coarse-grained things like apples that we also see? And Buffeau's idea is that what we're dealing with here are partitions of reality of different granularity. So if we were looking at the molecules, we'd have a very, very fine-grained grid when we were looking at the world. If we're looking at the buildings, we'd have a much bigger grain grid. If we were looking at the planets, or the solar systems, or the galaxies, we'd have even more coarsely grained grids. And the idea further is that our natural common sense language is talking about the everyday world is a coarse-grained grid. There really are apples, there really are chairs, there really are people, there really are baseball caps. There really are wavings of arms. This sounds trivial, I know. So Buffeau 1.0, 3 distinctions we've already met. So continuance continue, occurrence occur. You are a continuant, your life is an occurrence. You are 3-dimensional, you occupy the 3 dimensions of space, but you endure through time, where your life is a process, it unfolds in time, so it occupies space and time. This opposition is absolutely crucial for everything that we do. Now, we have, I said, dependent continuance, but we should really say specifically dependent continuance. And the simplest examples of specifically dependent continuance are qualities. And examples of qualities are, for instance, the whiteness of this cheese, or the mass of this banana, or the rigidity of this stone. And then in addition to qualities, we also have another kind of specifically dependent continuum, which are called realizables. And realizables are marked out by the fact they have realizations. An example would be a role, like the role of being a nurse or a student, which is realized in performing nursing activities and signing documents and so forth, or being enrolled in a college if you're a student. Then we have dispositions like fragility, which is realized by being broken or breaking when dropped. And then we have functions like pumping, which is the function of your heart, which is realized in processes of pumping. So, for a disposition, each disposition is associated with a certain process of realization. That is to say, the type of disposition you're interested in is associated with a type or universal of realization. So for the disposition to go bald is associated with the process of losing hair. The disposition to eat is associated with the process of buying a hamburger or consuming food. And we have dependence relations here, not just between the dependent continuance and its bearer, but also between the process and the disposition which it realizes and the bearer of that disposition. So every process stands in need of some agent or some independent continuum which it is a process of or in. So now we have different kinds of processes. We have disposition realizing processes, we have functionings which are function realizing processes, we have playings of roles which are role realizing processes. And then we have junk processes, stochastic processes, which are not realizing processes, completely random processes. And they're just examples. So anything in red here is just an example. So, this is perfectly clear. Now we're up to here. This is as far as we've got. Now, as it happens, we won't talk about this today, but diseases are dispositions. You can think of functions as good dispositions and diseases as bad dispositions.